The evening sun slid low over Dustwell, turning the dirt road into a slow-moving river of copper light. Shadows stretched long across the wooden storefronts, and the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain, a scent that always made Silas McGraw feel like someone was calling his name from far away. He rode into town with his daughters bundled close behind him, Mabel June with her spine straight as a fence post, and Clara Rose with her tiny hands clutching the back of his coat like she feared the world might tip her off. Silas had been a widower long enough for grief to settle into the cracks of his voice, the lines of his face, the heaviness of each breath. But tonight, he told himself, he wasn't here for anything except supplies. That was all, nothing more. Dustwell, however, had its own ways of pulling a man into something he didn't expect. Marshal Boone Calder stood on the saloon steps, chest puffed, boots spread wide, announcing the annual Homesteader Choosing Night, the event Silas had hoped to avoid. Boone's voice carried like a gunshot striking an empty canyon. Men gathered on one side, women on the other, each group wearing expressions carved out of shame, fear, or something close to surrender. "Pick any woman willing," Boone declared, as though he were announcing the start of a card game instead of a ritual that scraped at people's dignity. "If you need a helper at home, a cook, a companion, you choose. Settle it fair and done." Silas felt his stomach tighten. He didn't want this. He didn't want to stand among men who looked desperate or cruel, or women who stood like unlit lanterns, waiting for someone, anyone, to take them home. He wasn't ready for another presence on his ranch. He wasn't ready for the way the world might twist that presence into something he didn't have the heart or energy to explain. He stepped to the edge of the crowd, his daughters pressed to his sides, trying not to be noticed. And that was when he saw her. Willa Hart stood far from the cluster of women, as if she had learned long ago that closeness led only to disappointment. Her dress was faded blue, stretched at the seams that fitted over her soft, sturdy frame. Her hair, thick and brown, was braided loosely down her back. But it was her eyes, downcast, steady in their hurt, that held Silas for a quiet moment he couldn't explain. She seemed like someone who had spent years trying to take up less space than she needed. Someone who'd been told too many times that she wasn't wanted and had begun to believe it. Etta Lou Canyon, Dustwell's unofficial town crier of gossip, leaned into a friend and whispered loudly, "That one? She's been passed over 3 times tonight. No cowboy wants a big girl who carries herself like she's dragging thunder behind her." A few men laughed. Willa pretended not to hear. The daughters beside Silas stiffened. Silas exhaled slowly. He hated the event even more now. He wasn't here to pick anyone. He only wanted to pick up nails, flour, maybe a jar of peppermint drops for Clara Rose. He'd promised himself he wouldn't get tangled up in any town business. But the girls were watching everything with wide, solemn eyes, and it felt wrong to drag them into this place of judgment. He turned toward them. "We best leave," he murmured. But Mabel June, the elder at 12 with a heart that understood people better than most grown men didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on Willa. Clara Rose followed her sister's stare, her small face wilting with worry, as if she recognized the shape of someone else's loneliness. Silas touched Mabel June's shoulder. "Come on now." And then it happened, the moment that shifted the ground beneath his boots. 2 small hands clutched his coat. 2 little voices rose softly, trembling with certainty. "Papa, that's her." The words barely lifted past the dust, but Silas felt them like a bell tolling in his ribcage. He looked down at his daughters, then followed the invisible line of their gaze to Willa Hart, standing alone, trying to hold herself together. He swallowed, unsure why his heart suddenly felt like it was walking ahead of him. Boone Calder's voice boomed again. "Make your picks. Don't dawdle. Choices don't make themselves." The crowd shifted. Men stepped forward. Women stood straighter or shrank back. Silas's instinct was to leave, but the girls' whispers rooted him in place. "Why?" he whispered to Mabel June, almost afraid of the answer. "Because she looks how you look when you think we ain't watching," she said quietly. Clara Rose added, sad but trying. Silas's chest tightened until he couldn't breathe right. The laughter and gossip continued behind him, buzzing like flies. Folks already knew Willa Hart would walk home alone again. They knew Silas McGraw would never pick another woman, not after what grief had carved out of him. But Silas found his boots moving forward, not out of pity, not out of obligation, because something inside him, something long dormant, rose like a whisper of its own. He approached Willa slowly, as if sudden movement might startle her like a skittish mare. She noticed him only when he was close enough for her to catch the dust of his breath. Her eyes lifted, guarded but soft. "I'm sorry," she said automatically, as though she expected him to reject her before he even spoke. "I wasn't standing in the way. I can move." "You're not in the way, ma'am," Silas said, voice low, hat held respectfully in his hands. "Not at all." She blinked, confused. Silas cleared his throat, feeling the heat of eyes watching from all sides. "My girls, they took a liking to you. We were wondering if you'd join us for supper tonight. Nothing binding, just company." Behind him, someone snorted. Another whispered, "Desperate man." Etta Lou's voice cut through the air. "Lord save him. Widower's losing his mind." Willa flinched at the words, as if they were stones thrown at her. Her hands tightened around the hem of her dress. Silas took a breath. "Ignore them," he murmured. Willa looked at the ground. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You wouldn't." Still, she hesitated. It wasn't fear, it was disbelief. The disbelief of someone who'd grown used to being turned away, never invited. Then Clara rose peeked from behind Silas's coat and whispered, "Please? You seem nice." Mabel June nodded firmly. Something warm flickered through Willa's expression, almost too faint to see. She nodded once, slowly. If it would help you, I can come." "Thank you," Silas said, and the gratitude in his voice surprised even him. As they walked away from the saloon, the murmurs rose behind them, but Silas didn't look back. Willa walked carefully beside him, like someone who didn't want to disturb the air. The girls kept close, smiling shyly at her, as though she were a lantern finally being lit. Silas felt it then, not love, not yet, but a shifting of weight inside him. A loosening, a quiet, steady recognition. He didn't know where this would lead. He only knew one thing. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, none of them, not Silas, not Willa, not the girls, would walk home alone. The McGraw ranch sat quiet as twilight bled into night, a soft lavender settling over the fields like a blessing. Willa Hart stood at the wooden table inside the small kitchen, hands gentle as she shaped biscuits with the care of someone who never assumed her work was welcome. Silas watched her from the doorway the way a man watches a sunrise he hasn't asked for but feels grateful to witness. She moved slowly, steady as a heartbeat, humming a tune so faint it was almost just a breath. The girls hovered near her, Mabel June asking questions about cooking, Clara rose, clinging to her skirts as though she belonged there already. Supper was simple, broth, biscuits, a little honey, but it tasted softer somehow, warmer than anything Silas had eaten in years. He found himself listening more than talking, letting the hush of her voice fill the space where loneliness usually sat. There was no dramatic spark, no blazing revelation, just glances that lingered a moment too long and silences that felt safe enough to rest inside. But when the plates were cleared and the candles burned low, Willow wiped her hands on her apron and stepped back, her breath shifting the air. "I should go," she said quietly, eyes lowered. "I've stayed long enough." Silas felt a small panic rise, not loud, but sharp. "You sure? Girls would like you to stay a bit more." She shook her head. "I don't want folks saying more than they already do." Those words sliced deeper than he expected. He escorted her outside, boots sinking softly into the dusk-warm dirt. Crickets chirped in the tall grass, and the moon was just beginning to climb the ridge. "I'm grateful you came," he said quietly. It meant something. She offered a timid smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for letting me." When she walked away down the dusty trail, lantern light flickering against her figure, Silas stood there long after she disappeared, feeling as though something important had slipped between his fingers. By morning, that feeling turned heavier. At the market, he overheard voices, sharp, cruel, slicing the air like broken glass. "She's trying to trap him. Etta Lou declared loudly, her voice carrying down the rows of jars and sacks. Willa Hart always did dream too big for her britches. She stuffed herself into that widower's supper like a rabbit in a wolf den, another woman snickered. Probably told the girls to beg her to stay. Silas watched from behind the stacked crates as Willa stood frozen, a basket of flour in her hands, her shoulders rising and falling in tiny tremors. She didn't confront them. She didn't defend herself. She simply set the basket down and walked away, head lowered. Silas felt something in him snap, not a wild anger, but a protective ache that burned clean and quiet. He left the market with his supplies untouched. When he returned home, Mabel June met him at the door, face tight with worry. "She isn't coming back," she whispered. "Clara saw her by the road crying. She said she won't ever bother us again." Silas's pulse stumbled. He wasn't a man who chased things, not dreams, not hopes, not people. But the idea of Willa believing she was trouble, believing she wasn't wanted, twisted something deep inside him. He saddled his horse without a word, the girls watching with round, hopeful eyes. The wind tasted like dust and thunder as Silas rode out, following the narrow trail leading westward. Shadows of cottonwoods stretched like fingers across the ground, and the world felt painfully quiet except for the rhythmic pounding of the horse beneath him. He found her near the dry creek, sitting on a fallen log with her bonnet in her lap. The late afternoon light caught the tears on her cheeks, making them shine like small pearls. She didn't look up when he approached. "Willa!" She flinched at the sound of his voice, then wiped her face quickly, ashamed of her own grief. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for any of this to cause trouble." Silas dismounted slowly. "It isn't you causing trouble. It is," she insisted softly. "People talk. They always have. And I just keep thinking maybe I shouldn't have come. Maybe I let myself believe I mattered. But I know better. I've always known better." Silas sank to one knee in the dust beside her. He wasn't sure when he'd last knelt for anyone, but it felt right. "Necessary. You do matter," he said, voice rawer than he meant it to be. "My girl saw it before I did. Truth is, I've been so afraid of feeling anything again that I forgot what goodness looks like. You reminded me." Willa stared at him, shocked, like she'd never heard anything soft spoken to her in her life. Before she could answer, voices echoed across the creek. Marshal Boone called her, and half the town riding up the ridge. Dust swirled around them like storm clouds. Silas stood, jaw tightening. Boone's horse stomped up to them. "McGraw," the marshal barked. "Town's buzzing. Folks say you've taken a liking to the Hart woman. We need this settled clean. Is she the one you want to bring home?" Behind Boone, Etta Lou and others waited, faces painted with mockery, curiosity, judgment. Willa froze, breath caught in her throat. Silas could feel her shaking beside him, see the way her hands curled against her skirt as though bracing for humiliation. The old fear returned, fear of gossip, of expectations, of the weight of a man's word in a small town. But then he looked at Willa, really looked, at her trembling shoulders, her soft eyes already bracing for rejection. The years of hurt she carried like a shadow. And he heard Mabel June's voice again. "She looks how you look when you think we ain't watching." Silas stepped forward, slow but unwavering. He placed himself between Willa and the crowd, shielding her with his own body as if that alone could stop the cruelty of the world. "She's the one my girls chose," he said, voice carrying with unexpected strength. "And she's the one I choose too." Gasps rippled through the group. Even the horses shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in the air. Willa's breath broke like a fragile dam, and shock washed across her features, followed by something softer, something like hope that had been waiting years for a moment like this. Etta Lou sputtered. "Are you serious?" "That." Silas cut her off with a single glance. "I'm done letting folks decide my life for me." Willa stood still, tears welling again. But these weren't the same tears she'd wept before. These were gentle, disbelieving tears that belonged to someone standing at the edge of a new life. The crowd gradually dispersed, thrown off balance by the quiet firmness in Silas's voice. Boone nodded once, almost respectful, and turned his horse around. When the dust settled and silence returned, it felt like the whole world had shifted a few inches toward something better. Silas turned to Willa carefully. "You okay?" She nodded, but her chin lifted, not shy, not small. There was dignity in her now, settling like morning sunlight over her shoulders. For the first time, she seemed to take up her full space in the world. They rode back to the ranch together, the trail stretching ahead like a promise. Silas didn't reach for her hand, and she didn't reach for his, but the space between them felt warm, alive, blooming with something slow and steady. When they arrived, Mabel June and Clara Rose came running, joy bursting from their faces. Willa smiled, fully, brightly, and the entire ranch seemed to breathe easier. Later, as night settled and fireflies drifted through the grass, the narrator's voice settles softly over the memory, speaking to the listener as though sharing an old truth learned the hard way. Sometimes the world will measure you by shadows and whispers, by the narrowness of its own gaze. But every once in a while, you meet souls who see you in your truest shape, quiet, steady, shining in ways you never knew you could. And love, real love, begins not with grand gestures, but with a whisper that changes everything.